does it go from epididymis? Vas deferens, yes. From vas deferens going through the ejaculatory ducts and all that stuff that you learned, ultimately to get out. It takes about a month to do that. That's the process the sperm is actually maturing. It's very fascinating in terms of, if you learn in physiology, in terms of maturation, what happens to it. So you know, for example, reproductive physiology, or you know, people who can't have babies is a big business. They go in there, they test everything, they test the environment for the sperm production, they test the number of sperms, they test, you know, other glands such as prostate, seminal vesicle, vulvourethral, what they produce and how they produce, what's happening with the sperm. Sperm is very high maintenance, and it's very delicate. And you have, for each ejaculation, you have several million of the sperm is produced, but only one sperm makes it all the way to the egg. So you know that if two sperms makes it to the egg, we call them what? Twins. You know, when you have two sperms get in there, and then they can fertilize two eggs, then you end up with twins. That would be fraternal twins. But the maternal twins, when the egg and the sperm come together and then they divide, become maternal twins, where they're pretty much identical, because you have pretty much the same structure that divides. All right. So this is, in a nutshell, the male system. So this is the seminiferous tubules. Process of spermatogenesis happens here in the Sertoli cells, and their sperms, they drop into the lumen and then travel through the lumen of the seminiferous tubules into the epididymis, into the vas deferens, and then from there it's continue all the way out. So I'm going to be looking at the structures pretty shortly here, and then I'll show you in a diagram how this is happening.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Epididymis, is it spelled M-I-S or M-U-S?
M-I-S.
Really?
Yeah. Epididymis.
Well, that's not how you spell on the thing.
Oh yeah, it's I-S. That's my typo if it's not. But epididymis is spelled this way. But don't worry about it. You won't get penalized. Yeah, you won't get penalized. That's M-I-S, yes. Whoops, it's a little too late. But yes. Anyways, this is the structure and how they're produced, and ultimately they get out. This is the production of sperm. Now, I can actually draw the same diagram for females. So females, a little more complicated. Actually, not much. If you're okay with this one, can I erase this? Did you take notes? If you took good notes, I can erase this. And I go over the female, because I guess we don't have enough room here on these boards, especially the way I write. So just go ahead, and if you're going to take a picture, you're going to write it, whatever you're going to do, go for it. I'm going to come back and do the same thing for females. So let's go ahead and, are we okay to erase it? We're good? All right. Oops, I didn't do that. Darn it. But that's okay, I can put the abbreviations there since you already know. For females, female structures, the same thing happens. By the way, if you're wondering, so at what age, you know, these signals start producing. For example, at what age hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary to go ahead and produce hormones. You're going to learn in physiology, you have other organs, other glands that actually produce sex hormones, not as much, of course, very little, but then there's a signal. That's one theory. The other theory is that usually the body fat increases, for example, letting these central nervous system know that, okay, it's time to have a baby. So basically, you go from evolutionary perspective. So if you look at the hypothalamus again, and this one communicate with via GnRH, this is female. To anterior pituitary, I don't have to rewrite this, so you know this, right? So, actually, hypothalamus is a little wider. To anterior pituitary really says FSH and LH. Easy enough? So these two hormones, again, this is exactly the same thing happens with the males, it's happening with the females. Now, if I ask you in the females, what does the LH do? Right, say, well, hormones. Here, you can talk about what hormones? What female hormone? Estrogen. Estrogen, yes, you can talk about estrogen. Now, the LH stimulate the production of estrogen. How? Briefly, I'll talk about that here. A lot of this stuff, again, it's a physiology, particularly with the cycle of these hormones. But I'm not going to bother. I just want to tell you that which hormone is stimulated by which hormone coming from the anterior pituitary. Follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates the follicle, right? Follicles that are located where? In the ovaries, yes. So the follicles that are located in the ovaries. So if you see a little diagram in your book or in my notes, diagram of a cross-section of ovary. So this diagram that you see here, in this diagram you see these little circles that they grow like this, and then suddenly an egg being ejected here. So we call them ovulation. What is responsible for follicle stimulating hormone? When a girl, baby girl, a young girl reaches puberty age, let's say with the start, what happens, the first menstruation or first ovulation that's going to happen, it's going to happen by the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone, letting the anterior pituitary know it's time, then it's going to stimulate the growth of the follicles. So you notice that in the notes I mentioned a couple of different forms of these follicles, primordial to primary to secondary to all that stuff. Ultimately, this is going to get to the point of what we call an ovulation. The egg is going to be released, and this follicle that released the egg becomes a little bit oldish. We call them what?
Corpus luteum.
Corpus luteum, yes. Corpus luteum, or yellow body. So this corpus luteum that is formed, yes, Lisa?
Do we need to know what releases estrogen? Like on the male, you said that it was the Leydig cells that released it.
Yes, and I'll get there.
Okay.
See, just a second, I'll get there.
Okay.
So I'm just grabbing this end of it. So talking about the follicle stimulating hormone. What is the follicle stimulating hormone doing? If I call this primary follicle, basically stimulating the follicle to grow, right? That's what I said, the male reproductive system has stolen this concept from females, because that's what we have in females, but we don't have follicles in males. So this grows to secondary, Graphian, all that stuff that grows to different various terms that it's taken, but we really don't care about them. Just know that the follicle grows. Now, as the follicle is growing, allowing the follicles to release more estrogen. So more estrogen is being released. But we don't, Luisa, to answer your question, we don't really necessarily need to know which cells.
Okay.
You have different cells in these follicles that actually produce those hormones. We just don't care. We just know that follicles are responsible for releasing more of estrogen. So as the estrogen is released, so this is actually in my notes, I asked you about the ovarian cycle. What did you tell me what ovarian cycle was? What are the phases of ovarian cycle? You said one, follicular phase, where the follicle is growing, right? Where the follicles are actually growing, which takes about 14 days, right? The second phase would be ovulation. And the third phase will be what? Formation of corpus luteum, remember this? Or luteal phase. These are the three phases of the ovarian cycle. Which, by the way, there's an overlap with this. We talked about uterine cycle or menstruation. How does that happen? So I'm not going to worry about it. I'll let physiology class you worry about the uterine cycle and how it overlaps with this one and how the phases work with this one. But I think this is simple enough. So for you to know that when the follicle stimulating hormone is released, stimulates these follicles, which takes about 14 days. Ovulation happens. After ovulation, corpus luteum is formed. If I ask you, Rachel,